This opening passage of Toshio Hosokawa's composition, Vertical Time Study 1, might sound static and motionless. When we look at the score, the lack of audible meter, resulting from the long-held notes, rests, and fermatas, is one contributing factor for this perceived stasis. Despite the presence of time signatures and the approximate tempo on the score, this passage sounds as though the musical events are punctuated at random intervals on an otherwise still texture. This sense of stillness is heightened in measures 3 and 6. In these measures, the meter and tempo are no longer in effect in notational sense. For example, the notes are without stems and empty measures are without rests. Without these markers, the tempo becomes incomprehensible because it is defined by the duration of an eighth note. How can we make sense of these measures that diverge from the notational convention? How can we understand the resulting sound that fades into silence as anything other than stasis? Drawing from the title of the piece, Vertical Time Study 1, I interpret these motions to silence as composer's invitation to a new vertical dimension of time afforded by the Japanese calligraphy. These opening measures guide us to listen to the whole piece with the calligraphic sensibility. What does it mean to listen calligraphically? As opposed to the note values and tempo markings, musical time in these measures call for an understanding that goes beyond what is ascribed in notation. To illustrate, these passages motivate me to hear them as a gradual lifting of a brush. Just as the sound slowly decays to silence, an imagined brush tip exits the paper, leaving a blank space. The blank space on paper does not mean that the calligrapher's movement has ceased. Above the paper, in the vertical space, the calligrapher prepares the next stroke. In other words, the time flows in the vertical space, which is not visible on the calligraphy. Hosokawa often describes his compositions through Zen calligraphy. In his 2003 lecture, he talks about a lesson from a Zen Buddhist who practices calligraphy every day as part of his meditation. In this lecture, Hosokawa draws a connection between Zen calligraphy and his music.
He told me the line which you can see is only a part of this whole line movement. Behind this line, you have here very important, significant blank space. But this blank space is as important as this line. The sound which you can listen is only a part of the whole sound movement.
Hosokawa applies this whole sound movement idea in his compositions in various ways. Sometimes it is applied directly, as in the opening passage of Sen 6 for percussion solo. Here is the first 1 minute of the piece, performed by the dedicatee Isao Nakamura. Hosokawa instructs the percussionist to move their body in certain ways. For example, a motion of drawing a big circle, as shown in the opening passage. This exaggerated arm and hand motion in the opening is not a choreography that accompanies the musical sound, but is part of the whole sound movement. The sound which we can hear is pregnant with this musical motion. Many rests, slurs, and fermata are not the silence devoid of musical action, but are part of the whole sound movement, some of which produce an audible sound while others do not. When the percussionist just pretends to attack, for example, This is a musical event even though there is no acoustic signal. The influence of calligraphy can be extended to a conceptual level as a way to reimagine the fundamental building blocks of music. In Japanese calligraphy, and more broadly in the East Asian calligraphic practice, calligraphy begins with making the ink by grinding the ink stick on a stone. After a while, the transparent water becomes darker and ready for the first stroke. This ink-making process makes the calligrapher aware of minute variations of ink's density every time they prepare the ink. Often, an amateur calligrapher like me realizes after the first stroke that the ink is too thin or too dense. Both conditions make it unsuitable for writing. If this is the case, a calligrapher either grinds more or adds more water until the desired thickness is achieved. Even when the ink is ready for writing, the moisture level constantly changes, and each stroke reflects the condition of the brush, paper, and the room's humidity, in addition to the calligrapher's technique. A calligrapher negotiates between these constrained conditions. A skillful artist incorporates these constraints to create the writing that is situated in the present. This contributes to a myriad of variations, even in a single stroke. No two strokes are the same from this perspective. From the ink-making process, I have become more attuned to the different states of blending and the resulting multiplicity of a brush stroke, which helped me formulate the idea of calligraphic listening. The intricate balance between water and ink and the resulting change of density in the fluid mixture bring forward the blending as a non-reversible process. When listening calligraphically, I'm hearing the musical sound similar to a blending instead of a combination of disparate and separable notes. This is a different attitude towards musical sound than the Western classical understanding. The Western pitch space and time model after Cartesian coordinate space, where the horizontal axis spans for time and vertical for pitch. In this view, a note is an object on a plane that never dissolves. It may be combined to create a chord, but it's still identifiable as a distinct unit, a chord tone. For example, when I hear these chords, I identify these chords by parsing out each chord tones separately. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. I can hear the same sound as a blend. One way we often visualize sonic blending is through its waveform. When we think about the waveform, we can think of each sonic simultaneity as its own thing. The peaks and valleys of a waveform do not tell us each chord tone. Once the notes sound, it is thoroughly blended and cannot be parsed out, like mixing water and ink. In this view, the relationship between a note and a chord is not based on the quantity or the number of notes, but based on the density, the thickness of the sound. We can establish the connection between this sonic object with a calligraphic stroke by foregrounding sonic attributes. For example, I hear the first chord as a shape that has a clear attack, a gradual decay, and a timbral uniformity coming from a single instrument. Also, the chord is presented within a relatively constrained register within an octave. The sound in low register also gives a sense of weight. With these attributes, I can imagine a calligraphic stroke with congruent properties. For example, a deliberate pressure as the brush contacts the paper corresponds with the chord's clear attack. The gradual decay corresponds with the speed of brushstroke. Timbral uniformity and constrained register correspond with a smooth, straight line with decreasing width. This can be achieved by lifting the brush gradually. A low register corresponds to a thicker ink. Altogether, I can imagine a brush stroke something like this. By hearing the sound as a brush stroke, I'm treating the sound as a singular object that can be described through different attributes. And I can also imagine this stroke to take one of many possible shapes because each attribute is a point on a continuum of possible variation. In other words, we can construct what Manuel de Landa calls possibility space by parameterizing the sound and stroke, that is, by providing it with knobs with modifiable settings, the values of which determine the condition of the identity of the emergent whole at any given time. Even though I only have a single stroke in front of me, I can easily think of it as one of many possible strokes with these foregrounded properties. Following this method, the listeners can create new parameters or omit some for their interpretation. The idea of blending can be extended to non-pitch elements like timbre. For example, I would add the parameters of brush's moisture level to reflect the amount of buzz. All these elements are blended to imagine a single brush stroke. The passage as a whole can be imagined to take a shape similar to the stroke above, where the progressively drying brush creates splitting threads. I would like to emphasize the oneness of the blended sound. Even though many notes might be played to create what we hear, they merge into a single sound with more density or complexity. By treating the combination of musical elements as a single blended sound, I am echoing what Toru Takemitsu observed about the nature of musical sound in Japanese traditional music. A tone, in this view, is a complex concept that emerges from the interaction between the instrument, the performer, and the surrounding environment. Toru Takemitsu, for example, tells a story about his sukiyaki dinner with the master shakuhachi player. After dinner, the master performed a solo shakuhachi piece. Following the performance, the master asked, "Were you able to listen to the simmering sounds of the sukiyaki throughout?" To which Takemitsu acknowledged he could. The master continued that, "Then it is proof that I played well. That is because my music is the sukiyaki sound." A tone, as a blended sound, attains complexity in this way. Takemitsu remarks that, with some exaggeration, I might say God dwells in a single sound. While Takemitsu's statement referred to Japanese traditional music, other composers with East Asian heritage observed a similar distinction between the meaning of a single sound in East Asian and Western European musics. Wen-Chung summarizes the East Asian concept of tone as follows. Each single tone is a musical entity in itself. That musical meaning lies intrinsically in the tones themselves, and that one must investigate sound to know tones and investigate tones to know music. Their remarks highlight the difference between East Asian and European meanings of a tone. Their remarks offer us a new way of thinking about the fundamental unit of musical meaning. The focus is not on emphasizing the East-West divide, but it is about broadening our musical understanding through multiple perspectives. The calligraphic listening strategy does not require the listeners to be calligraphers. What is more important is to listen to music with aesthetic concept of calligraphy, such as the flow, merging of ink and water, and the way it gives meaning to blank space. Calligraphic listening strategy can be summarized into three principles. First, consider the composite sound as a primary unit of musical meaning, rather than a single instrument or a pitch. Second, reflect on the energy, gestures, and constraints that underlie the sound. Third, incorporate the stasis between acoustic events as a necessary part of the sound. This is where the preparation or completion of an acoustic event takes place, in the vertical space. We can apply this strategy to Hosokawa's other compositions. In closing, I invite you to imagine a calligraphic stroke that corresponds with this passage from Toshio Hosokawa's Vertical Time Study 2. What does the stroke look like? Which calligraphic parameters would you foreground that best reflect this passage?